فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So for today, I want to return back to Surat Maryam, in particular verse 29 of the chapter of Mary. And in this particular section, we see the climax of the story that Maryam has already had Isa or Jesus. She is told to make a vow of silence. And now she's returning back to her people. And the people are asking her questions, they're mocking her, they're scorning her. They continue this attack on Maryam. And they say to her, your father was not a bad man, your mother was not unchaste. And then for the verse for today, she points at him. So she basically, فَأَشَارَتْ إِلَيْهِ, she points to her child. And they said, how can we converse with an infant? And then that leads to the speech of Jesus, of Isa. And here we see the importance of speech once again emerge in the Surat Maryam. We see that they say, قَالُوا كَيْفَ نُكَلِّمُ مَنْ كَانَ فِي الْمَهْدِ صَبِيًّا. And they ask, how can we talk to, or how can we be in conversation with someone who is simply in their cradle, sabiyya? And you can hear that beautiful rhyme that continues throughout the chapter of the iya. And as we discussed before, we see that there is this idea of speech that emerges throughout the Surat Maryam, but also throughout the story of Maryam itself. So for instance, if we look back earlier to Ali Imran, so there are two major parts where the story of Maryam is discussed. And that is first in Ali Imran, which is understood to be a Medinan chapter, and then later in the chapter of Mary. And it's mentioned that Jesus, one of his miracles is that he's able to speak. وَيُكَلِّمُ النَّاسَ فِي الْمَهْدِ وَكَهْلًا مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ. And that he was someone that was able to speak in the cradle and when he was older, and he was among the righteous. One of the miracles of Jesus is the ability to speak at different points of his life. We also see that there is this commonality with other prophets. So if we recall in the biblical and Quranic tradition, one of the things of Moses, one of his miracles, or one of the things that he's known, is the idea of speech and speaking to God. And that God actually spoke to Moses or Musa. And there are many different verses that speak about this, but a particular one says that there are many messengers which we have narrated to you, and there are other messengers which we have not. وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. And God has spoken to Musa in a beautiful and righteous way. There is this idea that God is speaking constantly, and that's part of God's power, but it's also his intimacy and his closeness to particular people. That God has the ability to speak to whoever he wants, and he has the ability to give speech to whoever he likes. And here we'll see that he gives speech to that of Jesus. Also, we see it throughout the chapter of Maryam, this idea of speech. So if we recall that Zechariah, he calls out to God in this nida and khafiyya, in this quiet and private way. And he wants God to hear him because he's older, his wife is barren, he doesn't have the ability to have children, and he prays out to God, and that God responds to his call to have progeny, so someone who will live out his legacy. And in that particular sign, God says, قَالَ رَبِّ اجْعَلْ لِي آيَةً. So Zechariah, he requests God and he said, give me a sign. And he says, آيَتُكَ أَلَّا تُكَلِّمَ النَّاسِ, that your sign is not to speak to people for 3 days and 3 nights. So this is part of the divine sign of God, is that Zechariah is supposed to be silent. He's supposed to be quiet. He's not supposed to relate or speak to others. This idea of speech and silence plays throughout the Qur'an, and particular in this specific story. We also see this was told of Maryam, that when she has Isa or Jesus, she's told, فَقُولِي إِنِّي نَذَرْتُ لِلرَّحْمَنِ صَوْمًا, that you've taken literally a fast or a vow of silence. And فَلَنْ أُكَلِّمَ الْيَوْمَ إِنْسِيًا, will not speak to anyone today. So once again, even though Maryam has a child and this child's understood to be out of wedlock, she's told not to speak to anyone. So this interplay here of silence and speech are scattered throughout the chapter of Maryam. Zechariah, he speaks in a quiet way where God hears him, but then he's told to be silent. Maryam calls out and she says, I wish I was dead. I wish I was someone who was forgotten. But then she's told to be silent. And this sets up the speech of Jesus. And it also speaks to a larger divine quality that we see in the Qur'an. And the definition of God in monotheism is that he's the one that speaks and that he has the ability to speak. So we see this throughout the Qur'an, in particular that of Maryam. So in another verse, not in the chapter of Maryam, we see that Maryam is praised, that she's seen as someone who was chaste, that Gabriel blew his spirit into her, وَصَدَّقَتْ بِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّهَا, and she was true to the words of God, وَكُتُبِهِ وَكَانَتْ مِنَ الْقَانِتِينَ, and she was true to his scriptures, to the books, and she was one of those who was devout. So once again, this idea of speech, kalimat, and kutub, or books that actually encompass speech, is mentioned. We also see that on the final day. So there's a lot of verses in the Qur'an that speak about the end of times, the apocalypse, the day of judgment. And in this period, there will be speech. People will speak to one another. They'll show regret. They'll show happiness. And one particular verse towards the end of the Qur'an is mentioned where the spirit, يَوْمَ يَقُومُ الرُّوحُ وَالْمَلَائِكَةُ صَفًّا. So the idea here is this amazing image where Gabriel, Jibreel, Ar-Ruh, which is the spirit literally, and the angels, they'll come together in a particular row. وَلَا يَتَكَلَّمُونَ, and they won't speak. So even though they're powerful, even though they're the angels of God, they will be silent because they don't have the ability to speak unless God gives them that ability. إِلَّا مَنْ أَذِنَ لَهُ الرَّحْمَنُ, except that whoever the most merciful gives permission to them, وَقَالَ صَوَابًا, and then God will say what is true. So even though the angels are powerful, that they have the ability to give life, to destroy people, to enact various commands, on the day of judgment, they will not be able to speak except by the will of God. God will only give whoever he wants speech, and they'll say what is correct. And there's even traditions that speak about particular limbs. So a hand will speak, or an eye will speak, and they'll talk about what they saw or what they did. So even if someone denies doing something in particular, God will ask the limb that committed the action, did you do it? And they will say yes. So once again, all these traditions and verses are all going back to the idea of Tawheed, of the one God, of monotheism, and the idea of this absolute God that has the power to speak, but also has the power to make things silent, whether that be the angels or prophets or the righteous. That speech is something that he gives and is part of his power. So in conclusion, we see several themes that emerge in this particular verse. First is the idea of mockery, right? So Maryam comes back to her people and they're telling her, you come from a good family, right? You are a righteous person. You have a good father. You have a good mother. How could you do such a thing? And then instead of defending herself, she simply points to her child. And even in contemporary Arabic, this idea of lughat al-isharat, so of sign language, that is just about motions. And she just motions her hand to her child. And then they mock her again and say, how can a child speak and defend you and speak on your behalf? So this, as we can recall, that this chapter is emerging in this late Meccan era where many of the companions, the Prophet Muhammad in particular, were told that he was a sorcerer, that he was a magician, that he was mad. So there was a lot of attacks on the Prophet Muhammad, and in similar ways, there are these attacks that we see on Maryam. Also, we see this idea of speech continuously emerge throughout the chapter, that people speak, but they speak in ways that only God hears. So Zechariah speaks, and he tells God in a secret location and a secret place his true innermost ideas. And one of his feelings is that if he dies, there will be no one to live out his legacy. That he sees death on the horizon, his bones are weak, his hair is white, but he wants to have progeny. He wants to have someone to live out who he is and what he's done in his life. Even though that speech is done in private, God hears that speech. And then he, in fact, grants Zechariah his wish, but then he tells him that he must be silent and not speak too much. We also see that with Maryam, that she's alone, no one's with her, and no one really can hear her speech, but she speaks anyway, and God hears her pain, her suffering, and then provides her with dates and a stream. So this idea of speech and not speaking is essential throughout the Qur'an and in the definition of monotheism, that God gives, that God is as-sami', that he's the one that hears. So even though someone can speak in silence and someone could also speak in private, that God will eventually hear that speech. But at the same time, God is the ultimate speaker. That someone who speaks then is told now to be silent and allow God to take over and implement the action. We also see this remarkable connection with that of Moses and Musa. When I first started this chapter, I was looking for connections, and often there is this idea of Maryam and Isa being connected to Christianity, but we see a lot of connections here with that Moses. And Musa was someone who spoke to God. God spoke to Moses, and Musa spoke to God. So there is this idea of speaking to God, and the same verb, kallama, is used in reference to Musa in the Quran, is also used in reference to Maryam and that of Zechariah. So we see that the Quran is making this intentional connection between the Abrahamic faiths, that Maryam is not seen as someone who is distinct from that of Moses, of Musa, of that of the children of Israel, but she's in many ways continuing a legacy, that she is a child of that tradition, and that the Quran is implicitly or explicitly connecting her to the mother of Moses, of Musa, and to Musa himself. Thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I encourage you to order my book. So I have several friends who ordered the book and they just received it in the mail. You can subscribe to this podcast, which is available on Apple and Spotify and YouTube, as well as other podcasting networks. Encouraging your friends, students, and colleagues to listen to this podcast. I'm teaching a class on marriage and sexuality in Islam this fall, and I've assigned several episodes of the podcast to the students. You can review this podcast, and you can let me know how I'm doing, and you can visit my website and join my newsletter, where I'll be giving away some free books, as well as talking about future events and book launch programs. Thanks so much, and take care.